Hi, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'm uncovering an Everest climb where a woman watched a high-altitude trekking video and decided to attempt Mount Everest. Driven by personal ambition and the need to maintain her public image, she believed preparation could replace experience, repeatedly dismissing guidance from her team. Decisions that compounded in worsening conditions and led to a fatal miscalculation in the death zone. It was May 14, 2017, during a midday lunch break at a home furnishings company office in Denver. The environment was routine and controlled, the low hum of the HVAC system a constant companion. Employees stepped away briefly from work to check their phones, a ritual before returning to scheduled tasks. At 38, Rena Cuesta had built what most would consider a successful life in suburban Denver. Her corner office, with its panoramic view of the Rockies, reflected a career built around control, outcomes shaped by planning, leverage, and the ability to push variables into place. Her social media account, boasting 12,000 followers, showcased a carefully curated life where even spontaneity seemed scheduled. The way I see it, everything had to happen on her terms: angles, timing, presentation. It didn't feel like she experienced things, it felt like she managed them. Her outdoor experience was limited to short, well-maintained hikes, rarely exceeding 5 miles, usually timed for perfect lighting. The video that redirected her focus was only 4 minutes long. A fitness influencer she followed documented a high-altitude trek on Nanga Parbat. The influencer moved confidently across snow-covered terrain, the wind a visceral roar in the background, describing raw endurance and personal limits pushed. Rena replayed it repeatedly, seeing it as the missing piece for her plateauing career and social media presence. It honestly felt like she watched that video and immediately placed herself in it, as if the gap between watching and doing wasn't as big as people make it out to be. Yes, 4 minutes of video, and suddenly Everest feels achievable, as if the gap between watching and doing could be reduced through effort alone. Her preparation began immediately. She hired a personal trainer, former Olympic hopeful, purchased a full high-altitude climbing kit that soon filled her spare bedroom. Down suits rated for extreme cold, mountaineering boots, oxygen masks, and regulators. Each item was meticulously documented on social media, building anticipation for the grand undertaking. She pointed to the equipment she had purchased and the support team assigned to her, referencing them repeatedly when discussing her readiness for the climb. It's the kind of setup that looks convincing online, but doesn't mean much when things start going wrong. Physical training proved more demanding than expected. Cardiovascular and functional workouts exposed glaring gaps in her endurance. She added hypoxic, masks, and altitude chamber sessions, simulating up to 25,000 feet. She must have thought this made her ready for anything, but there's a huge difference between a chamber and the real mountains. Persistent headaches, waves of nausea, and disorienting confusion, even at 15,000 feet, were interpreted as signs of progress. By February 2017, Rena had committed to the April to May expedition. The financial investment, public announcements, and expectation of documenting her triumph made the decision feel inevitable. At this point, there's no turning back, but clearly, turning back might have been the wiser choice. Her employer, impressed by her ambitious goal and the potential publicity for the company, granted an extended leave of absence. Colleagues expressed a mixture of admiration and concern, noting that Rena had never mentioned serious mountaineering interests before announcing her Everest plans. It must have been strange for them. One day she's managing meetings, the next, she's planning the world's highest climb. Several friends questioned whether she was adequately prepared for such an extreme undertaking, but she dismissed their concerns, pointing instead to her training, the money invested, and the professional team she had hired. She framed their doubts as a lack of perspective, an inability to understand what structured preparation and commitment were supposed to achieve. The flight to Kathmandu in early April marked her first time in Asia, where the unfamiliar sights, noise, and higher altitude made it clear she was far outside her comfort zone. Her expedition group included 12 clients and 4 guides, many with extensive high-altitude experience, while Rena's background was limited to weekend hikes and a single technical course completed just a month earlier, despite her instructor recommending at least 6 more months of training. But Rena, ever confident, approached the expedition with the expectation that the guided structure would compensate for her limited technical skills. During briefings, she pushed for clear timelines and definitive outcomes, often returning to the same questions when answers didn't match what she was looking for. When the guides explained that conditions dictated everything, she reframed it, asking what could be adjusted, what flexibility existed, and whether exceptions were ever made for clients. I can imagine how frustrating that must have been for the guides, trying to explain that the mountain doesn't operate on guarantees, while she kept looking for one. The trek to Everest Base Camp took 10 days, following a route that gradually increased in altitude to help climbers acclimatize to the reduced oxygen levels. At 17,600 feet, Base Camp sat higher than any peak in the continental United States. Rena experienced mild headaches and fatigue along the way, symptoms her guides noted as normal altitude adjustment. I remember thinking how strange it must feel to be tired and lightheaded at what feels like just walking, but at that height it's totally expected. She seemed to interpret caution as a weakness, though I could see how easily excitement and competition could take over. The trek also revealed the relentless physical demands of extended mountaineering. Each day meant 6 to 8 hours of hiking while carrying a pack weighing 30 to 40 pounds. The terrain switched constantly, from well-maintained trails to rocky scrambles to tricky stream crossings. Rena's feet developed severe blisters despite her expensive mountaineering boots, and her shoulders ached from the pack weight. I can't imagine how frustrating it must be when you've trained with weighted packs, yet reality still hits harder than practice. The sustained effort over multiple days seemed to be far more challenging than she had anticipated. Base Camp itself challenged almost everything she thought she knew about the expedition. The temporary city of tents and equipment stretched across a glacier, surrounded by ice formations that shifted and groaned throughout the day. The pervasive smell of human waste and cooking fuel hung in the thin air. Climbers from dozens of expeditions shared the space, creating a strange mix of camaraderie and tension. Rena struggled to find privacy for her daily social media updates, and the unreliable internet connection quickly became a source of visible frustration. She repeatedly attempted uploads, refreshing connections, asking staff about signal strength, and expressing irritation when the answers remained the same. That connectivity at Base Camp was limited and unpredictable. I could almost picture her trying to get the perfect post while the glacier creaked around her. It must have been surreal. Living conditions at Base Camp were more primitive than she had expected. Tents were pitched on uneven rocky ground, with temperatures dropping below freezing every night. The dining tents served communal meals, but high altitude affected appetite and digestion for most climbers. Rena found herself eating less than usual and losing weight despite the physical demands of acclimatization. The guides kept a close eye on her weight, noting that excessive loss could indicate poor adaptation to altitude. It must have been strange to feel so physically taxed while your body simply refused the fuel it normally needed. The acclimatization process required multiple rotations through higher camps, giving climbers a chance to gradually adjust to the extreme altitude before attempting the summit. Her first rotation took her to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, reached by crossing the infamous Khumbu Icefall. The route was intimidating. Aluminum ladders spanned deep crevasses, flexing under every step. I could practically feel my stomach drop just thinking about walking across those thin ladders, let alone carrying a full pack. Rena moved through the section with visible impatience, repeatedly questioning pace, spacing, and safety assurances from the guides, as if the route should adjust to her comfort. Massive ice blocks shifted unpredictably around them, but she seemed more focused on controlling her experience than matching the mountain's rhythm. It looked terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, though her pace lagged behind more experienced climbers. The Khumbu Icefall was her first real brush with objective danger, environmental hazards she couldn't control or predict. The glacier constantly moved, opening new crevasses and shifting massive blocks of ice that could crush a climber in an instant. Each day the route changed, with guides scouting new paths and installing fresh ladder crossings. Climbers typically crossed early in the morning when the ice was coldest and most stable, but the danger could never be fully removed. Just thinking about it, I can see why experienced climbers treat this as a real test of nerves, not just physical strength. At Camp 1, she experienced her first significant altitude symptoms: persistent headaches, waves of nausea, and severe difficulty sleeping. The guides monitored her closely, noting that her oxygen saturation was lower than ideal for continued ascent. They recommended extra rest and a more conservative approach for the next rotation. Rena interpreted their caution as overprotectiveness, often pointing to other clients who appeared to be progressing more quickly and questioning whether the same standards were being applied across the group. She didn't take pace adjustments as guidance, but as something to be challenged and negotiated, repeatedly pushing back on whether the slowdown was necessary and measuring the guide's instructions against her own expectations of how the route should be moving, as if the conditions themselves were open to debate rather than fixed. Sleep at Camp 1 was particularly rough. The combination of altitude, biting cold, and the stress of the unknown made it nearly impossible to rest. Rena often woke up gasping for air, feeling disoriented and exhausted. The guides explained that sleep disturbances were normal at that height, but I can imagine how disheartening it must have felt, waking up even more drained after a night that should have restored her energy. Poor sleep compounded the daily effort, turning each climb into a monumental challenge. Her second rotation took her to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, and then to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet. Each camp brought harsher conditions, colder temperatures, thinner air, and heavier reliance on supplemental oxygen. By the time she reached Camp 3, Rena had already begun using bottled oxygen earlier than the standard protocol, despite repeated guidance that it was reserved for higher altitude use. The guides had planned for oxygen use to begin at 26,000 feet, but she insisted the timing should be adjusted to match her symptoms, treating the protocol as something flexible rather than fixed. The breathing difficulties at 24,000 felt unacceptable to her, and she repeatedly framed it as a mismatch between the plan and what she believed she required in the moment. This choice reduced her reserves for the critical summit push, but she remained confident that the system would adapt around her pacing. Camp 2 was located in the western CWM, a vast glacial valley surrounded by massive ice walls that formed a natural amphitheater. Temperatures during midday could soar, creating a blinding glare and what climbers called a solar oven effect, as the ice walls reflected and concentrated the sunlight. Most climbers left before dawn to avoid the intense heat and the risk of avalanches from warming ice. I can't even imagine stepping out into that glare, knowing the ice around you could start moving at any moment. It must have been like walking on another planet. Rena struggled to keep her body temperature steady as conditions swung from freezing cold to scorching heat. The ascent to Camp 3 meant climbing the Lhotse face, a steep wall of ice rising nearly 4,000 feet above Camp 2. The route followed fixed ropes anchored to the ice, requiring climbers to use mechanical ascenders, or jumars, to pull themselves up. Rena's technique was inefficient and physically demanding, costing her far more energy than the experienced climbers around her. Her breathing grew labored early in the climb, and she needed frequent stops just to recover. I'd probably be hanging there with my heart pounding, questioning every decision I'd made to get there. During the descent from Camp 3, the guides noted what they considered mild symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, subtle confusion, slight coordination problems, and delayed responses. The symptoms eased at lower altitude, but they were a clear warning that her acclimatization wasn't complete. The lead guide suggested an extra rotation or extended rest at base camp before the summit push. Rena, however, questioned whether the recommendation was precautionary rather than necessary, shifting the focus to the narrowing May weather window and what a delay would cost her in timing. I can see why she would feel that pressure, but it also felt like she was treating the recommendation as negotiable rather than corrective. The final weeks at base camp were consumed by obsessive weather monitoring and meticulous equipment preparation. Everest's summit can only be attempted during brief windows when jet stream winds shift away from the peak, creating relatively calm conditions. These windows last only a few days and are unpredictable. Multiple expeditions track the same forecasts, which can create congestion on the route when the weather aligns. The guides emphasized strict turnaround times. Any climber not reaching the summit by early afternoon would have to descend, no exceptions. I can picture the tension at base camp, everyone staring at the same weather reports, knowing that timing could mean the difference between life and death. Weather forecasting for Everest was a huge deal. The guides had to analyze the satellite imagery, atmospheric models, and reports from climbers already on the mountain. The jet stream winds could exceed 100 miles per hour, which honestly sounds like an instant death sentence if you're caught outside. Even in the good windows, winds at the summit rarely dropped below 20 miles per hour, and the temperatures stayed far below zero. Rena spent the waiting period glued to weather reports, checking every update multiple times a day, and obsessively scanning social media posts from other expeditions. She noticed some teams seemed more aggressive with their summit timing and started wondering if she had picked the wrong outfitter. I can't help but picture her pacing the tent, staring at a laptop screen, biting her lip, calculating whether she was ahead or behind everyone else. It must have been nerve-wracking. The competitive energy at base camp, with multiple teams chasing the same fleeting windows, only made her impatience worse. Equipment preparation was a full-time task in itself. Every piece of gear, every glove, oxygen mask, and regulator had to be checked, rechecked, and tested. Oxygen systems were especially critical. One failure at extreme altitude could be fatal in minutes. Each climber carried 2 cylinders for the summit, with flow rates carefully calculated to make sure they would have enough for the climb up and back down. Rena's oxygen use during acclimatization had been higher than average, which meant adjusting her planned flow rates. And even then, her guides were quietly concerned whether it would be enough. On May 12th, the forecast finally showed a potential summit window starting May 14th. The guides called a team meeting to review the plan and hammer home safety protocols. From Camp 4 to the summit, the route would take 12 to 16 hours, starting before midnight, so there was enough time to climb up and return. Climbers would use supplemental oxygen the whole way, with reserves calculated for the descent. Turnaround times were strict. Anyone not at the summit by 1 p.m. had to descend immediately. I can't imagine the pressure. One wrong calculation, and you could be stuck in that death zone. The ascent to Camp 4 on May 13th was the final staging point. At 26,000 feet, the South Col is what mountaineers call the death zone, an altitude where the human body simply cannot survive indefinitely, even with supplemental oxygen. The camp was a cluster of small tents anchored against constant wind, with temperatures that barely rose above 0 degrees. Most climbers spent only a single night there before making the push to the summit or retreating to lower ground. Just being there, surrounded by wind, cold, and so little air, would feel like walking on the edge of the world. I can't imagine sleeping through a night like that. The South Col was a desolate plateau, scattered with abandoned oxygen cylinders, torn tents, and decades' worth of expedition debris. The constant wind ripped across the plateau, sand blasting ice crystals and rock particles against any exposed skin. Even the simplest tasks, like eating or changing clothes, were exhausting. The altitude sapped energy in a way that made me wonder how my brain could even function. Cognitive decline hit most climbers within hours. I'd probably forget my own name up here if I stayed too long. Rena arrived at Camp 4 later than expected. She had struggled on the ascent from Camp 3, and her oxygen consumption was already higher than the guides had calculated. Despite this, she treated the adjustments to her oxygen plan as something that should be worked around rather than a limitation, questioning the revised margins and pressing for reassurance that the reserves would still be enough for her summit push, even as they were already being depleted. The guides recalculated her supply and warned that she would have almost no margin for delays or extended exposure above 26,000 feet. They suggested postponing the summit attempt until the next weather window, when fresh oxygen would be available. If I were in her shoes, hearing that after all the training and waiting would feel like someone had pulled the rug out from under me. Unsurprisingly, the suggestion triggered Rena's strongest frustration yet. Months of preparation, significant financial investment, and a social media audience following every update, all of it felt at risk. The idea of turning back now, after constructing a narrative of triumph in her mind and online, was unbearable. She dismissed the guide's caution as excessive, framing it as a misunderstanding of her drive and the commitment she had already made publicly, as if determination itself should outweigh the limits being set. The warnings were treated less as safety measures and more as obstacles to be argued around rather than accepted. The first major landmark above Camp 4 was the balcony, sitting at 27,500 feet and typically reached after 6 to 8 hours of climbing. The terrain was relentlessly steep, with hardly any opportunity to rest. Rena's pace slowed as the night wore on, and she began falling behind her assigned spot in the climbing order. The guides kept track over radio, noting that her oxygen use was exceeding the planned rates. I would have been watching that gauge every few seconds, knowing that every breath counted more than anywhere else on Earth. By dawn, she had climbed to roughly 27,000 feet, but was running nearly 2 hours behind schedule. The delay was partly caused by congestion on the route. Multiple expeditions attempting the summit at the same time created bottlenecks at technical sections. Yet her responses to the slowdown focused less on conditions and more on whether the system was being managed properly for her ascent. The guides recommended she consider turning around at the balcony if her speed didn't improve, but the suggestion only added pressure rather than changing her intent. At that point, I'd probably be torn between pride and survival, knowing that pushing ahead could be fatal, but also feeling the pull of all those months of effort and attention. Sunrise revealed the full scope of the route ahead, a narrow ridge stretching toward the Hillary Step and the final Tanat summit pyramid. The exposure was absolute, drops of thousands of feet on either side, the wind tearing across the ridge 25 miles per hour, driving wind chill temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't even imagine standing there for a minute without feeling like the air itself is trying to steal your breath. The combination of bitter cold, thin air, and sheer exhaustion tested every ounce of training, preparation, and judgment a climber could muster. At the balcony, Rena's oxygen gauge showed she had already used nearly 60% of her supply, far more than planned for this stage. The guides urged her to descend immediately, stressing that the situation was urgent. The official turnaround time of 1 p.m. was still hours away, but with her oxygen running low, the real deadline had become immediate. I'd be staring at that gauge and feeling panic creep in. Every breath would feel like a negotiation with death itself. Rena refused. She argued that she was close enough to the summit to continue, stating that she could manage her oxygen more efficiently with better pacing. She pointed to other climbers continuing upward as a reference, using their decisions to support her own. The guides tried to explain that efficiency typically drops as fatigue and altitude increase, but she dismissed their warnings as overly cautious. The climb above the balcony demanded increasingly technical movements. She had to manage her oxygen, keep position on the fixed ropes, and navigate the exposed terrain. Her coordination began to falter, frequent pauses to adjust the regulator, longer rests between sections, and other climbers started overtaking her. The guides maintained radio contact but were tied up with other clients, unable to provide hands-on help without risking the safety of the entire team. I can almost feel the frustration and dread building, knowing there's help nearby but not within reach. She had reached roughly 27,800 feet, still hundreds of feet below the summit. Her oxygen gauge now indicated critically low levels, maybe 30 minutes supply at her current rate. The guides issued a direct order: descend immediately. Oxygen depletion at this altitude meant rapid incapacitation and certain death. Over the radio, her responses were delayed and confused. Textbook signs of severe hypoxia. Instructions had to be repeated, and her actions lagged behind what she was being told. I'd be hearing those warnings and knowing that ignoring them could cost me everything, yet the summit feels impossibly close, teasing every ounce of stubbornness and hope. Even then, she continued trying to move upward and manage her equipment on her own, resisting intervention as if stopping or slowing was not an option available to her. I can't help thinking, by that point, it wasn't really a decision anymore, but the momentum of every earlier one carrying forward. Through the process, removing her pack, accessing the spare, and connecting the regulators was nearly impossible with heavy gloves in sub-zero temperatures. Her coordination, already compromised by fatigue and altitude, failed her. The cylinder change took far longer than she or anyone had practiced. For several moments, she treated the situation as something that should still work on her terms, even as her primary oxygen supply was interrupted entirely, leaving her exposed to the thin, merciless air. At 27,000 feet, just about 400 feet from the summit, she collapsed while still clipped to the fixed rope. Other climbers described seeing her move erratically, struggling for minutes before stopping completely. The primary cylinder was empty, and the reserve hadn't been properly connected. Without supplemental oxygen at that altitude, consciousness fades within minutes, followed quickly by cardiac arrest. I can't imagine the surreal silence up there, the wind howling, other climbers moving past, and knowing that there's nothing anyone can do in that instant. The altitude and weather made immediate rescue impossible. Other climbers were already at the edge of their own safety margins. Any attempt to intervene could have put multiple people at risk. So the guides coordinated with teams above and below, assessing options. The grim consensus: a rescue would almost certainly lead to more death without improving her chances of survival. It's haunting to think about the calculus of safety up there. Every decision, measured in seconds and lives, and the mountain never pauses for grief or hesitation. Later that day, descending climbers found her, unresponsive, still secured to the fixed line. Recovery was not attempted due to the extreme altitude and weather. Her body remains on Everest. Expedition logs and guide reports later detailed her delayed ascent, rapid oxygen depletion, and impaired decision-making, providing a clear sequence of events leading to her collapse. I'd be reading that sequence and feeling both awe at the mountain's power and a chilling understanding of how quickly it claims those who linger too long at the edge. Official findings concluded her death resulted from hypoxia due to oxygen exhaustion at extreme altitude, compounded by fatigue and incomplete acclimatization. Delayed turnaround timing, inefficient oxygen use, and impaired decision-making, classic high-altitude cerebral effects, were contributing factors. Investigators found no equipment failures or guide negligence. All safety protocols had been followed and repeated warnings issued. It's a stark reminder that on Everest, preparation and caution can still be overcome by the mountain itself, no matter how much we think we're ready.